A week after the murder of George Floyd, as an uprising swept the nation, the federal government decided that, rather than address the demands of the protesters to address racist police terrorism, that instead they were going to criminalize the movement. On May 31st, the Justice Department stated that they were going to treat any destruction of property as domestic terrorism, which means federal charges and some of the most severe penalties. This was clearly a brazen attempt to undercut the growing movement by redefining it as a violent, dangerous threat to the country, to frame the tens of millions who have come into the streets as an enemy, and by redefining property damage as somehow equivalent to terrorism or even worse than the rampant use of force by police. And we should remind viewers that the only people who've been seriously injured or killed in this movement have been protesters by the police themselves. The DOJ stated that they would be coordinating through 56 regional FBI Joint-Terrorism Task Forces, which bring together the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and state and local law enforcement. In other words, by defining the movement as terroristic, they were operationalizing this massive nationwide dragnet to criminalize the uprising against racism and target activists. Since this announcement, we have already seen how the government intends to make examples of people. They put out wanted posters and made arrests for those who allegedly damaged the statues of slaveholders in Washington, D.C. 2 lawyers in New York City have been accused of setting fire to an empty cop car, injuring no one, but are facing 45 years in prison nonetheless. Recently, we've seen the fruits of these repressive labors in the streets, particularly in Louisville, Kentucky, Portland, Oregon, and Columbia, South Carolina, among other places. In Louisville on Tuesday, 87 protesters were arrested while peacefully chanting for justice for Breonna Taylor on the Attorney General's front lawn. And get this, they are now facing 1 to 5 years in prison for intimidating a participant in a legal process, which is a felony charge. The Trump administration deployed many federal officials to protect statues nationwide, and in Portland, Oregon, home to a strong protest movement, the Customs and Border Protection's elite BORTAC unit and the U.S. Marshals Special Operations Group, which are allegedly there to protect the federal courthouse, are with local police carrying out serious brutality against protesters and journalists on a daily basis. Here's some footage to give you a sense of how bad it is. Most of the arrests conducted by these officers are for assaulting a federal officer. But here's the best part, no federal officers were actually assaulted. And in fact, people being charged with assault are actually just being charged for pointing laser pointers at officers. That's right, you use a laser pointer, you're guilty of assault. And this is what the U.S. attorney for that part of Oregon calls anarchistic lawlessness, laser pointers. Now, Columbia is the capital of South Carolina, a state whose political leadership is known for being pro-Trump and very racist. On May 30th, the day before the DOJ letter, and remember that fact, thousands took to the streets of Columbia demanding justice for victims of police terror, including George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. After an entirely peaceful protest and gathering, Columbia authorities hastily declared a curfew, and shortly afterwards, large numbers of heavily armed riot police stormed the crowd. Since then, over 80 people, protesters and bystanders alike, have been arrested, some with bail as high as $200,000, charged with a range of things, but certainly nothing that was actually seriously injuring anyone. Columbia-based organizer Kym Smith of the Party for Socialism and Liberation spoke to us about some of this. Kym, thank you so much for being with us here on Breakthrough News.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, you know, we've given some context to people about what's been going on in Columbia, just this massive wave of repression that is going on. I mean, if you could just give us the situation right now in terms of how many people have been arrested and what kind of charges people are facing.
Well, we've had about, in Columbia, since the rebellion started on May the 30th, we had about, initially, I think 38 people arrested total. And the bail fund that I'm a collective member of, the Soda City Bail Fund, we bailed out about 18 of those people we paid bonds for. And a lot of those people were arrested twice. We're here 5-6 weeks outside of the initial protest, and Columbia Police Department, they're still putting out wanted lists for protesters. Like they're still releasing lists and name. I had one person call me and say that U.S. Marshals came to her house and her job looking for her for protesting.
You hear these numbers and the number of people who've been arrested, you might think, well, were they out there, massacring people, or did they set half the city on fire? But I mean, it seems to have really just started with essentially a peaceful protest being corralled, and the police themselves being the ones who were the instigators.
Yeah, exactly. These protests were just a peaceful march. We marched up to Columbia Police Department, and they were in full-on riot gear and already just spraying people. They started spraying people with tear gas and just being as violent as they possibly could. Like one of my comrades got arrested he was giving out water. He was on a supply team and he was trying to give water to protesters, and they arrested him for inciting a riot and looting.
Columbia, it's the capital of South Carolina. Obviously, South Carolina has a reputation as being one of the more conservative states and having one of the more, let's say, brutal sort of prison industrial, mass incarceration, policing complexes. I mean, how consistent is this, do you think, with what you have seen, I guess, over the course of your life with Columbia? I mean, does this feel out of character, or does these sort of repressive law and order politics in the city seem to make sense based on who's in power?
It completely makes sense. Our governor, Henry McMaster, loves the prisons, loves the prisons. South Carolina has some of the worst prison conditions in the country. And our prisons actually were one of the first to get a COVID outbreak. And it's just so on brand for South Carolina, actually, this repressive policing and this over policing of Black and brown communities and this funneling of people into the prison system. They spend so much money on maintaining prisons.
And do you see something of a connection here between the fact that there are such oppressive social conditions and that when a mass movement is erupting, they feel the need to repress it, in the sense that, there's maybe a lot of fear? Because, I mean, you mentioned Governor McMaster, who I think is one of the biggest landlords in Columbia. I mean, these people seem to be sitting atop a very small, wealthy elite that's really holding people down. Do you think that's part of what's behind the repression, is maybe the fear of being swept away?
It's exactly what it is, because in Columbia, especially on the May 30th protest, we hadn't seen numbers like that. We hadn't seen Black and brown and white working class people come together in those massive of numbers. And I never seen that since I lived in Columbia, not up close like that. And you can tell that the ruling class of South Carolina was shook. They were scared. And this is them trying to save face. And this coming down hard is them trying to hold on to that power, because they see the solidarity and they see that we're rising up against this repression, and they are doing everything they can to hold on to this power, because they see that people are becoming aware and becoming conscious of all the contradictions in the system and everything that's happening here.
What has been the response to this crackdown? I mean, have people been, galvanized perhaps to step up and support those who have been arrested and to continue to raise these issues?
Yeah, it's actually really amazing and incredible to see. When we started the bail fund, we didn't know what was going to happen. We just knew that we needed it because we don't have it in Columbia. And I mean, we get donations from people all the time just saying, please continue to do this work. And we see so much community support, and so many people have volunteered to be a part of jail support and want to give people rides that get bailed out and want to get people the resources. It's so incredible to see. And it's so amazing that this is what the ruling class tells us. They tell us that there's no solidarity, you fight amongst each other and all this. And then you see us coming together and giving that community support.
Almost as soon as the protests began in Minneapolis and started to spread, President Trump and many other politicians were calling for more brutal crackdowns, including even the federalization of the National Guard and the use of regular U.S. Army troops to put down protest. In the May 31st DOJ letter, Attorney General William Barr references the tough tactics used in Minneapolis on May 30th, the night before. Now, I was actually in Minneapolis, and these tactics were just brutal, unprovoked attacks like this one.
Get inside! Get in your house now! Let's go! Light him up! Go inside now! Get in the house!
Get in!
Oh, God, that hurt.
In Minneapolis, local officials even boasted of receiving help from the NSA. So how deep does this coordination between the federal government and local agencies go? Were the crackdowns in Minneapolis or in Columbia, South Carolina, meant to lay the groundwork for the announced law and order strategy? To discuss the broader attack on civil liberties and the Joint-Terrorism Task Forces, the JTTFs, we now turn to Mara Verheyden-Hilliard, Executive Director of the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund. You've been working on civil liberties issues for some time. PCJF has done quite a bit around the First Amendment. I mean, where does this fit in terms of what we've seen, maybe, let's say, post 9/11, and what has, at least it seems to me, been a constraining environment for the exercise of people's constitutional rights?
I think placing the JTTFs in historical context, both in recent years and in the last 100 years, is really important. I mean, if we look consistently at what the role of the FBI and its predecessor organization, the Bureau of Investigation, has done, what the role has been, it has always had as a core component a political attack on the social justice movement in the United States and the racial justice movement and the movements for Black liberation. So you can go back to Marcus Garvey when J. Edgar Hoover was just a young Bureau of Investigation agent. That was the predecessor organization of the FBI. He investigated and they went after him to find some crime that they could charge him with. Then, of course, you have notorious COINTELPRO operations going after the peace movement and the Black liberation movement. And even in recent years, when Occupy took the streets and the parklands throughout the United States, at the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, we did Freedom of Information Act demands and litigation around these issues. And we found, and it's important to point out, this was the Obama administration, that the Joint-Terrorism Task Forces were targeting the Occupy movement all around the country, even though in their own writing they said over and over again that this was a peaceful movement. Now we come forward to June 1st, when Donald Trump's leaked phone call with the governors around the country took place, where he was berating them for not being tough enough on the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. And he and Barr and the Secretary of Defense were all on this phone call, and they were talking about how beautiful and wonderful the crackdown on Occupy had been, how that was the model that they needed to use, how they were now going to deploy the Joint-Terrorism Task Force and give them authority to go after the movement across the United States. And we know they're doing it. We've already, we know of people around the country who are getting questioned by the FBI who have been engaged in these demonstrations. So this is a completely political attack. It's a complete abuse of the concept of anti-terrorism authority.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of the abuse of authority there. But I mean, how consistent is this really with the overall, concept of the ability of people to go out and to protest and exercise their rights?
Well, this is consistent, as I said, with what the U.S. government and its intelligence and state intelligence agencies have always done against any social movement that is so impactful that it's starting to change consciousness in America. And so we can expect this to happen over and over again. But what we're seeing now is really interesting. Like going back to June 1st in Washington, D.C., the day that Trump had that governor's call was the same day that they had that massive attack on demonstrators and journalists in Lafayette Park, clearing the park for Trump's photo op with the Bible in his hand. But that was clearly a planned effort. And what they obviously thought they were going to do was have a shock and awe attack on the movement, which often impacts a new and growing movement. I mean, movements have to have space to breathe, to grow, to get larger, to reach more people. And they obviously believed with this massive violent assault, it would scare a lot of people. And you have millions of people who are coming into political life who may have never engaged in protests before across the country, people who are deciding that they're going to stand up and fight for something they believe in, that they're going to make common cause with others. And this kind of attack can say to people, you know, if you go outside, you're risking life and limb, it's dangerous. It had the opposite effect. The very next day, there were more people who came out in Washington, D.C., and of course around the country, and the day after, even more. So they've seen now that this violent assault that they've been carrying out and that others are carrying out, I mean, it has a terrible impact on people, but it's not having the stifling effect that it's expected to have. And so the other component of this is having this joint terrorism threat. It scares people. It makes people think, oh, if I go out and participate, I might get targeted. But it's really important for people to remember that this is part of what happens for every major movement for social change, and that we have to be strong, that we have to continue to push forward, that we can't be frightened back into our homes. And I think with this movement and with what we're seeing, people are fighting for their lives. It's not an elective protest. This is a protest based on humanity, on necessity, on liberation, and people aren't going to stop.